Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Greater Manchester Development Update. I'm Sarah Townsend, Editor of Place Northwest. I hope you've grabbed your coffees and enjoyed your first taste of networking in the other room. Today, we're bringing you a first look at our new event platform, Remo. Who'd have thought that, just months after Zoom became a household name, there'd be another piece of virtual tech to get to grips with? Well, we're confident that Remo is a great step towards a more authentic conference experience, while staying online and keeping everyone safe. So we'll be using this for all of our autumn events at Place Northwest and our sister publication, Place Tech. I'd like to thank our sponsors today, Morgan Sindall Construction, JMW Solicitors, LUC and Curtains. In terms of format, there will be two halves with networking in between. In the first half, we'll have a panel. Then in the second half, we'll have a presentation and another panel. There will also be networking at the end, so you can stay and sample the virtual buffet. The networking room is where you can join tables and video chat with other guests. So you can move around by double-clicking on a table to meet other people. You can take conversations private too, if you wish. Just see if there's a table of two free on either side and suggest to your new or old friend that they meet you there, for example, on table 26. You both then double-click on table 26 and away you go. There's also private messaging if you want to swap numbers or suggest times for follow-up meetings and so on. All that without the hovering with your precariously balanced cup of tea waiting for an opportune pause in the conversation. We've included a short video guide to getting the most out of the networking, which you can find at the top of the screen to the left of the speaker's green room. You can also click on the sponsors' logos to find out more about them. A handy tip, you can also drag the floor plan around and zoom in and out to help you locate what you need. If you haven't already, it's useful to create your own profile so that when someone clicks on you, they can see who you are, and it all helps you to work the room as you would do one of our physical conferences. And don't forget to pose questions to our panelists using the Q&A button as well, which is at the bottom of your screens. Remo is a new format for us. We're excited to be using it, and we believe it presents more user-friendly and authentic opportunities to get involved, rather than just sitting back and having a flat video experience. But please do give us feedback after the event. So, moving on to today's topic. I'm sure plenty of you have been watching BBC Two's Manctopia, which granted is mainly focused on the city centre, but it's certainly generated even more lively public debate about housing and development in one of the region's fastest growing conurbations. There's lots to talk about, from the rise of the M60 towns such as Stockport and Rochdale, to the impact of COVID-19 on development and the ever-changing policy environment, namely Robert Jenrick's planning reforms and the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. So let's kick off without any more spoilers from me. Our first panel discussion will ask, where next for Greater Manchester? I'm pleased to welcome to the stage our speakers, Melissa Kuriara, Associate Director of Planning at consultancy LUC, Alison Mackenzie-Folan, Chief Executive of Wigan Council, Chris Lloyd, Investment Director of developer Glenbrook, and John Searle, Director of Economy at Rochdale Council. Please could all speakers turn on your cameras and microphones if you haven't done so already. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Morning.
Morning. John, I'd like to start with you, if I may. As an economist by background, what would you say are the micro and macroeconomic factors, both driving and curbing development across Greater Manchester right now? And how is this likely to change over the coming year, do you think?
Well, I've not been, well, morning everybody. I've not been called an economist for a long time anyway. So thanks for that question. From a Greater Manchester point of view, I think the issue is that Manchester, as you mentioned earlier, is growing extremely fast. And Manchester has become the second city in the UK. We've got a great opportunity, therefore, to continue to grow. We've got lots of interest from inward investments, developers, businesses, lots of people wanting to come and live and study in Manchester and stay in Manchester. And I think that's for me, that's one of the major changes over the last few years. People who say, come to Manchester to be educated are staying in Manchester, whereas previously they would have gone away potentially to London, etc. At a GM level, we are also very well placed in terms of our kind of partnership approach. This ACMA has been going on for some time. More recently, Greater Manchester Combined Authority. That strategy, that relationship between the 10 authorities and the kind of growing, more nationally recognised Combined Authority with the GM Mayor, is a real plus point for us. And I don't think we should underestimate that factor actually, because I'm not a person who kind of lives by strategies. I like to get things done. But, you've got things like Greater Manchester strategy, the transport strategy, the local industrial strategy, all at kind of GM level. And all those things set the context and set the discussion tone with central government for further major investment in GM. And that's where, places like Rochdale and Stockport, Wigan, that we kind of already mentioned, it's a real opportunity for those towns to play a major part in the growth of central Manchester. And that is, we are going to come on to the GMSF, so I'll not talk too much about that. I usually get asked the question about GMSF, but the point of GMSF is about jobs, is about homes, and is about the environment. And to do that in a kind of structured way that brings the best for Greater Manchester as a whole. And that's, bringing that back to all that strategy is therefore, 200,000 homes, 5 million square metres of employment space, and however many jobs that translates into, that's the real opportunity for Greater Manchester and the surrounding towns. And from our perspective at Rochdale, what we've been trying to do is say, well, we don't want the kind of breadcrumbs from the table of central Manchester. We actually want to play an active part in this growth, and that's what we need to do. We need to create more jobs, more higher skill levels, higher wages, better gross value added in the economy for Rochdale, and Rochdale then contributes to what is happening at GM level. So I do think that there are massive opportunities in Manchester, and we are now starting to see that. Salford Quays started that, of course, but central Manchester is continuing in that growth as well, and there's opportunities there for people to look slightly outside of central Manchester and Salford as well for development opportunities. Where do I think it's going to go in the next year or so? Well, I'm not sure I've got the crystal ball for that one and the impact of COVID, which I'm sure we'll touch on, but assuming the majority of the impact of COVID is going to be relatively short term, my view as an economist is that if you create a strong economy and a strong business community, all those kind of points, then you will recover quickly from economic shocks, and you will recover better than other areas from those shocks. Economic shocks, property cycles, they happen all the time. COVID's a very different form of that, of course, with obviously a big health aspect to it. But Manchester, I think, therefore, is going to be well placed for economic recovery from this shock. The question we don't know at the moment is when is that going to be? And hopefully, we're not all heading towards an enhanced lockdown.
Okay, thanks, John. I think that was a really, really great kind of overview then of the sort of like broader kind of conditions and environment that Greater Manchester Development sits within. Going the other way then, drilling down a bit to what you're doing in Rochdale. To give the audience a bit of a refresher, Rochdale's delivering several major developments. You've got the 10-year town centre master plan, you've got makeover of Drake Streets, heritage regeneration, and then with Capital and Centric just announced yesterday proposals to build 200 homes on a derelict site at Central Retail Park. So can you talk specifically about some of the biggest regeneration challenges that Rochdale itself faces, which may also be aligned with other problems that Greater Manchester is facing, that projects such as your own are seeking to overcome?
Yeah, as I was saying earlier, what we've done is looked at ourselves and said, what do we want in the next 10 years? And so we've in effect produced our response. to and said, right, okay, in the next 10 years, Rochdale's growth plan is going to look at town centres, employment sites, residential growth, and connectivity. And all our projects and all our investment is geared towards delivering that. And the kind of things that is looking to deliver is things like a million square meters of employment space, 20,000 jobs, 12,000 homes across a 20-year period of the GMSF life. And some of the big projects that we're working on is things like Kingsway is already a strategic site at GM level. To get that finished off, we've got approval and a main contractor, I think CISCs are actually in the room, for the delivery of the Junction 19 road link, which then opens up a big area initially for the South Haywood H Park development. That's 1.5 million square feet. But then in the future, parts of the kind of Northern Gateway employment site, which is actually a collaboration between Bury, Rochdale and Oldham to deliver not only a nationally significant, but potentially internationally significant inward investment site for GM. And that's on top of all the other projects that we're doing, as you mentioned, in terms of major investment in Rochdale Town Centre. But one of the big areas we're focusing on is also because, of course, we've got a strength in terms of the M62 corridor and that providing employment opportunities for HGV movements and things like that. But also we're turning a bit more sustainably to the rail corridor and identifying the opportunity to build 7,000 homes along that rail corridor, which also runs almost parallel to the M62 at points. And that has a big opportunity for us in terms of a 14-minute journey time from Rochdale into Victoria. And so from a connectivity point of view, really enhancing Rochdale's position and connecting with GM. And that's where, the impacts of COVID, we don't really know, but, will people be less interested in having big city centre offices and more satellite offices in places like Rochdale that are easily connected into central Manchester.
Thanks, John. Alison, I'd like to come to you and get a view from another local authority. To John's comments, particularly in the first question, chime with you. Can you talk us through your own experience in Wigan? What are the challenges you're hoping to resolve through development projects, and sort of what are the main ways you're going about this?
Sorry about that, Sarah. Having button problems. I think
no problem.
Similar to John, really. I think the main messaging coming out of Greater Manchester and of Wigan really is that still we're very much open for development. So our strategic ambitions really remain unchanged. We're still really driving towards that sustainable development. Obviously, timing may have changed. We're really unsure about some of the, the impact of COVID. And obviously, at the moment, we're still really working through our resilience as much as recovery. So, the ambition still remains, but I think, the challenges are there. For us, the town centres across Wigan, so it isn't just Wigan, we've got Lee and we've got the district centres. They sort of remain the key drivers of economic activity for our borough. And so the substance really hasn't changed about what we want to do. It's really important. I think there's a recognition that even more so now that consumer trends have completely changed with the pandemic. We knew that, the competition from digital was there all of the time. So the diversification of what we can offer and the consolidation of particularly retail in our town centres is really important. In places like Wigan, there is too much retail space, so we need to do something about it, and also then think creatively. So where do arts and culture play a big part of our recovery in that diversified offer, and also making sure that we create really desirable places to live and work. So thinking about the residential offer in our town centres. So I think for us, it's really around anticipating what might come in the early autumn. Obviously, Greater Manchester are putting in a submission to government that's really important for Greater Manchester, and we need to prove that we can deliver on that. And I think, as John said, over many, many years, Greater Manchester has proved that it can deliver. We will be at the centre of the levelling up agenda. So I think in our submission for Greater Manchester, we've got to be strong to show that we can, play our part in the north of England on that levelling up agenda. And then there's sort of new opportunities, really. So the low carbon economy opportunity, the future of our environment is a fundamental priority for all of Greater Manchester. So I think all of us need to look at the other opportunities presented by, zero carbon plans in environment funds, and thinking about how we can all work together. So for us, the ambition remains there. Yes, of course, there are challenges, but, we are working to make sure that we can carry on with all of our regeneration frameworks and the work that we want to do, both in Wigan and also across Greater Manchester.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Alison. I wonder if actually, just to give a bit of background, could you talk about maybe the top two biggest projects in your in-tray at the moment, ones you're actually specifically working on at the moment in Wigan?
Apart from COVID.
Apart from that,
COVID, well, in the interest of the audience, I wouldn't talk about trying to save a football club, which is taking up a lot of our time, and obviously it's got issues attached to it. But we are really pushing hard in Townsend to regeneration. So the continued development of the galleries, which is a massive retail space within the town centre here, is out for procurement. So that's a big issue for us. We're waiting for the outcome of our future High Street Fund bid. And then linked to that, we've got work live space on King Street. We've got the regeneration of the pier. And then we're also looking at opportunities for a station gateway around our two railway stations in Wigan Town Centre, obviously with the opportunities of HS2. So, big projects around Wigan Town Centre. And then linked to that, we've also got transport. So unfortunately, we didn't get our bid through with Bolton in terms of transport links between Bolton and Wigan and up to the M61, but we're working with Greater Manchester on other infrastructure projects to see how we can make those work. We've just started off on the M58. So I think they're the two big sort of main projects that we're looking at to get over the line and get working on over the next couple of months.
Sure. Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, Alison. I was going to come on to you, Chris, for the developer view, but actually we've just had a question come in from the audience. This is, and it seems sort of appropriate to direct it, to raise it now. This is a question for Wigan and Rochdale. What are your challenges or frustrations when working in JV with developers? I wonder if you two might be able to sort of sum up your top bugbear, as it were. Alison, do you want to start off?
I was just going to say, let John go first. He's probably got much more direct experience than me. I tend to get it secondhand from my planning team and economic development teams. But do you know what? I think before I let John start, I'll try and be a little bit positive in saying that actually one of the strengths of Greater Manchester has been the fact that we do work really, really well in public and private partnerships. And I don't think we would have achieved so much across the city conurbation if we'd not been able to do that. Obviously, we have our off days and there are irritations and frustrations. So at this point, I'll pass on to John and he might elaborate on a few more.
Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Alison.
sorry, John, for that.
I mean, I suppose historically, developers would knock on our door and say, I want to undertake this development. Can I have a grant, please? And that'd be the extent of the conversation. Quite often, my response to that is no, we don't have the funds for that. But what is the issue? What is the problem? Let's work it through and let's find out that development. That's the way we approach it, and that's the way a lot of GM approaches it as well. And then what we will do is kind of partner or collaborate, with that developer to then try and access regional or national funding, for example, for infrastructure that might deliver the developments. So what my biggest bugbear is developers come to us and being closed book I want to sit there and have a proper conversation about what is the development, what is the issues here. Have you got a risk problem? Have you got a funding problem? Is there just not enough return in there? Is viability the biggest issue? And I think some developers do actually think that local authorities especially think profit's a dirty word. And profit's not a dirty word. You're not in this for the love of it. You're there to make a return for yourself or your shareholders or whatever. So be open book with us, I would say, is the biggest thing, and then we'll help you to get that development delivered. Okay,
that's interesting. So actually, although certain motivations might be aligned in terms of the the need to create jobs and regenerate areas, actually you'd rather developers were upfront as well with you about saying, well, how do we best make money from this as well?
We can't do this ourselves, and at times developers can't do it themselves. So partner up. It's as simple as that, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're also going to be talking more about private-public partnership in the next panel session. So hopefully our audience will stay for the whole thing, and then you'll hear more about this. Chris, coming on to you, our developer in the room, you're building in various spots across the conurbation, for example, in Stockport and Salford. Do some boroughs present greater opportunities in one sector than others, do you think? Be it sort of mixed use, residential, offices, leisure, or are the opportunities fairly well spread?
Well, if you go through sector by sector, I think there are, on a macro level, there is a shortage of industrial accommodation throughout the Greater Manchester region, and there is an oversupply of retail accommodation, in theory, throughout the Greater Manchester region, which presents an opportunity for a speculator, stroke developer, stroke investor. Offices is a bit of a head scratcher at the moment for obvious reasons. Some people think and I'm one of those. Some people think that this COVID is a bump in the road, a significant bump in the road, but it's not something that's going to reverse 100 years of urbanisation. And I think we all, everyone on this panel and everyone in the audience, all has a vested interest in offices succeeding and being used for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And I would be disappointed if offices don't become the flagship again in a couple of years' time for Manchester city centre. And there is certainly an opportunity for the Greater Manchester towns to benefit from there will certainly be a spike in demand for people working near home, people who want to work near home. And I think the one thing that we are learning is that, as tragic as COVID is, there are people seeing this as an opportunity to sidestep a bit of a nightmare commute, and that's an opportunity. That's a big opportunity. There are certainly viability issues in offices outside the city centre, and our scheme in Stockport, we could not be doing that without the assistance of Stockport Council. The work they've done with us has been fantastic. I can't speak highly enough for them. And and then retail. What do I think about retail? Retail's a funny one in that COVID is fast tracking all sorts of change and driving demand online. So we need to look at reducing the volume of retail accommodation. But I'm hoping that this gives central government the balls to do away with business rates at a certain level, because there is demand from independent retailers, and what kills that demand is business rates, frankly. So I've anecdotally, I've heard that independent retailer requirements are up in the last couple of months, and again, that's an opportunity somehow. So yeah.
That's really interesting. It's interesting to think as well, like what might have been going on in the last few months of lockdown. People setting up their own businesses, for example. Maybe the flip side of redundancies that have taken place and so on is that, more people have set up alone, or maybe thought that this business idea that they've had on the back burner for many years, they seized the opportunity to do it. So I think that's really interesting that you're actually seeing that anecdotal evidence of demand for kind of space among maybe those kind of outfits as they look to sort of scale up. You slightly preempted my next question to you, actually, which was how has COVID impacted the growth of the M60 towns and other outlying areas versus the city centre? I was going to ask you, will the suburbs thrive in the wake of the pandemic, with city centres left underpopulated as some fear? You've sort of half answered that, but I wonder, and sort of said you think that actually, offices will continue, hopefully, to thrive again in the future. In not too long. But what about this growth of suburbs? What could we see there, and what are the opportunities then for Greater Manchester here?
Well, there is, as I said before, there will be, I anticipate, a spike in demand for office suites, flexible office suites in all the Greater Manchester towns. It's the only concern is whether everybody, and developers included, can react to that quick enough to benefit from it, or whether in 6 months' time there's a vaccine comes across and everyone goes, oh well, that's all right then, and everybody piles back into the Manchester city centre, back down to London and what have you, and the opportunity's been missed.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. But do you think this might, looking at the M60 towns specifically, this could well be a time to really for them to thrive and sort of deliver on promises that they've been made and sort of plans that they've been working on for decades even?
Yeah, but I don't think I can overemphasize the point is they have to react quickly.
Sure. Okay. We've had a couple of questions in from the audience. One from Stephen Hopley. Each borough has similar strategies in terms of town centre development, diversification, quality of employment and district centres. So how on a borough level do you ensure collaboration over competition? This is quite interesting and actually touches on a point, one of my questions later on. I wonder if anyone particularly wants to address that.
Well, if I may, I think
of course.
I think the starting point is identifying the opportunity and the piece of real estate to start the conversation. So in Stockport, we identified the former Marks and Spencer's building as an opportunity to reposition as an office building. So I think it's piecemeal, looking at the towns and looking at the specific pieces of real estate that are underused, are ripe for repurposing, and that then you can start engaging with the local authority, with local occupiers, with local stakeholders to bring them forward.
So I'm going to move on to talk about actually a big piece of news, particularly relevant to our conversation, is the publication of Robert Jenrick's planning reform white paper last month. So while we're yet to see which proposals are implemented, the document does point to a further relaxation of planning rules to drive development and growth. Melissa, I wonder what you think this means for the city region and also, of course, the much delayed Greater Manchester Spatial Framework.
Yeah, so obviously most people will be aware that the planning reform white paper was published about a month ago, and it does propose some quite radical changes to the planning system. Now, I don't propose to try and talk about all of them today, but I think it could have some quite significant impacts on Greater Manchester in particular. So the proposals, the fundamentals of it are a complete kind of redesigning of the planning system. So they're being talked about as the biggest change since the planning system was set up. And whilst every reform that's been brought out always claims to be the most radical, I think this does actually potentially take us quite close to that. They kind of talk about 3 pillars, which are all kind of underpinned with greater community involvement, trying to bring in more beautiful design, modernisation, kind of the use of data and digital, with the most important factor that they're trying to speed things up. And quite often they talk about planning as being the cause of low build out and the cause of things being slow. And I think that's unjustifiable, really. I think planning is the gateway to sorting all of these things out, and I think quite often is seen as the barrier, and it's not, and that doesn't seem to have gone away. They still seem to think planning is the issue, and the problem is that land use planning decisions are difficult and they are complex and they do take time. So I think whilst the ethos and the idea is to try and speed things up, whether that will actually work in reality, because any change like this just brings about great uncertainty. And whilst there are going to be transition arrangements in place, anyone who's working on local plans, so all of the districts and local authorities are now going to be back to, oh, well, do we carry on with what we're doing, or do we wait for things to change and use the new system? And I think that uncertainty is the opposite of what we need to try and get things speeded up and moving forward quicker. I think Greater Manchester is an area of the country where people do like to work together and try to get things through quickly. So I think that is good. So even despite all of the uncertainty that's there, Greater Manchester will press on and try to bring forward its plans, despite national government trying to slow things down, is kind of how I see it.
Fair enough. Okay. And yeah, this revised time frame published yesterday for the GMSF.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been further delayed due to COVID. No surprise there. Instead of the consultation taking place in August, it's now going to happen in November, with the final version due to be submitted to government by next summer. So as you say, people are itching to get this done. And yeah, hopefully the will is there also among the Greater Manchester authorities. This report to the GMCA yesterday, which outlined this new revised time frame, did mention the need to have some recognition and sort of solutions for the impact of the pandemic in the final kind of version of the GMSF. Do you have any thoughts on what those kind of solutions might be, or not just solutions, but sort of, I guess, clauses in there to kind of accommodate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a massive topic to suggest that we might be looking at certain things that have changed, because quite a lot has changed, and certainly I think a lot of people's thinking has changed as a result of the pandemic. I mean, I know that it's been a kind of a wake-up call to a lot of people for something close to our consultancy's heart, is kind of the importance of green space and green infrastructure, and actually seeing that as fundamental and not something that can be kind of added on afterwards or thought about later. I mean, it's been so important when people were stuck at home during lockdown that they had access to good quality local green space close to them. And I think whilst there's been great work done in the Greater Manchester region on green infrastructure, it's something that perhaps could be coming to the fore more, and certainly people want to see slightly more. But I mean, impacts from the pandemic have been so wide-ranging. I mean, we've touched on them slightly already in terms of the changing nature of shopping in the high street, and the fact that kind of online shopping and big logistics to actually ensure that things can be moved around the country and delivered in the same way is something that might have to be rethought about. I don't think that there should be huge amounts of changes to GMSF. I think it's good to just try and get something moved through the system and adopted sooner rather than later. So I'd hope that there wouldn't be too much change. But again, another area is office developments. And I think there probably will still be a place for office developments in the future, but people have got used to working from home. And I think some companies have realised that actually they can do things from home where they perhaps would have been a little bit reluctant before. Some employers are now realising that people could work from home. And I don't necessarily think that'll be full time. I think there will still be a place for offices, as Chris said, in terms of it's important for those town centres. And actually, I think people do work differently when they're in the office. But it might be that there's a slight difference in terms of how often people are going into that office. So whether there needs to be some rejigging around that office provision. So I think kind of waiting with bated breath really to see what changes on that front.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vanessa.
So just to pick up on that point, I think the interesting challenge for developers is office design and how offices are designed and how they're fitted out and how they will accommodate businesses who will, they'll have a couple of staff working 2 days a week at home, and then they'll be in the office 3 days a week. So collaboration and sharing information will come to the fore, I imagine, and the office needs to be designed around that, I suspect, going forward.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Welcome back, John. I know you're having some technical difficulties, but it's great to see you back. I don't know how much you caught of the last sort of 5 minutes of our conversation, but we're talking about the planning reforms, the revised timeframe for the GMSF, the impact of COVID on the GMSF, not just the delivery of it, but the content of it. I wonder what your thoughts are from a local authority point of view. What might be the impact of these policy sort of movements on housing delivery in Rochdale and across the city region?
Well, can you hear me first of all? Yes.
Yes.
I mean, for me, the GMSF is a 20-year program, and as I say, you know, it's about creating jobs and homes and supporting the environment. So, yeah, economic cycles, property cycles, as I said earlier, you know, they come and go, and you know, this will evolve over 20 years. It's not as if we're going to click our fingers and everything will happen in year one. And so, the part of the issue, you know, the government has quoted about planning, the need for planning reform, is that things like local plans take 5-7 years, and you know, there's always another bus coming along, in the sense of, you know, housing numbers are going to change, and population growth statistics are going to change, and different planning policies are going to change. For me, let's get it done. You know, sorry, I sound a bit like Prime Minister there, don't I? But let's just get GMSF done, get it over the line. It will evolve over time. That bit is certain, and you know, that's where you do need the government's support at kind of planning inspector level to support a big plan for growth and development, and that's what this is. And for GM to be collaborating in this way is not easy. But it'd be a far worse position for us all to say, oh well, no, let's just scrap GMSF. It's not working. It's too difficult. Let's all go away and do 10 different local plans. That's the whole point of what we're not trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your views, Alison?
I totally agree with John, really. I think we've been in the midst of it, haven't we, John, for so long now. You know, this is about being ambitious together. And, you know, it is groundbreaking what we're trying to do in Greater Manchester. And I think we've all, you know, there's been so many conversations, lots of different options. We've looked at the impact of what might happen with the new proposed legislation. But for now, I think there's a determination across Greater Manchester. We recognise there have been lots of difficulties, you know, over Greenbelt and all of the issues that people will know. But, you know, there's a determination now across Greater Manchester that we get through this through our decision making and governance structures over the next couple of weeks. You know, it goes to full council and cabinets, and we will, you know, get this out to consultation and get this done. So similar to John, I think we just have to get on with it and see what happens. Things are going to change, of course, but there is a determination to do this. And there's a team been working really, really hard on it. There's been a lot of compromise, hasn't there, John? There's been a lot of hard work, but I think we're in a good position now, personally. I think hopefully John will agree that I think we're ready to get this over the line and move ahead.
Brilliant. Yeah. That's great to hear. I mean, do you think in general, Alison, not even talking about the GMCF, these actual documents that are being prepared, but across the board, do you think there's sufficient collaboration between all of the GM boroughs when drawing up their own plans, as in individual sort of town centre regeneration strategies and things? Do you think there is enough?
I think there is a lot, because we're very lucky in Greater Manchester to have the combined authorities, so we have that expertise and resource and relationships within the combined authority teams who work well with the districts, and they will see, you know, the ability to link us all up. And obviously there's a lot of offline discussions, so John will be going into exec directors of place discussions on a very, very regular basis. So, you know, there are lots of different spaces to have those conversations, have those tensions, have those disagreements. Of course we can always do more, and sometimes there will be that occasional conflict, But generally, I think the strength of GM and the strength that as we continue to go forward has been around the ability to come together when we need to come together. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what John thinks when he's in some of the depths of the directors of place meeting. But I get a sense that we do as much as we can on collaboration, with the help of GMCA sort of guiding and steering us through and offering that stewardship and expertise and resource.
Okay. John, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of just roll back a little bit, GMSF is about appropriate structured development over time, and that's where the collaboration bit is paramount. So some of the districts, the 10 districts, aren't delivering as many homes as per their target, but that's where you collaborate with your neighbours through the GMSF for overall the package is that we deliver what we think the future housing need is, for example. And also just to reiterate that GMSF is definitely not all about greenbelt release. I think the figure is something like 75% of the homes are actually on brownfield land. And a lot of those are already contained within district local plans as well. So people do get, for obvious reasons, people do get a bit excited about the greenbelt release aspect of it. But for most of the homes, it's brownfield. Now, a big chunk of the employment land is greenbelt, but that's because there aren't many big employment sites out there, and that's what Chris was talking about earlier. The opportunity for new development is quite restricted in GM. And just on kind of town centres and town centre collaboration. Now, retail, for example, there's an element of competition, say, between Rochdale and Oldham town centres on retail and some aspects of leisure in the town centre. But you've got to be a bit grown up about that, and that's what we try to do at GM level in those conversations that Alison was referring to. For example, we're having conversations like, should we be looking at a town centre strategy that is across GM, that is more of a framework for how do we approach repurposing town centres and redeveloping them over time. And then that could be our pitch to central government at GM level, and then it's over to local authorities and districts to deliver that as per the specifics of their town centres. Because local authorities know their town centres better than, say, the combined authority could and arguably should. So that's where the kind of collaboration needs to come together, a bit further. I'm not saying we're not doing it. We're doing this all the time, but you can't do everything today. We've got to be thinking about what's next as well, and lots of other of these conversations about further devolved powers to GM. So we have a history of delivering. So central government, give us the support, give us the taxation structure, business rates mentioned by Chris as well, there's a business rate review going on at the moment. Give us that structure nationally for us to go away and deliver it. That's what we want to do.
That's interesting, the idea of this sort of blueprint for a town centre regeneration that would allow councils to sort of take that as a framework and kind of map it to fit its own case, its own situation and circumstances. And maybe that might become more important post-COVID, because a lot of these trends, perhaps in terms of retail footfall, etc., office use, might be more kind of across the board, really. Arguably, we don't know. But
yeah, but the issue that we're facing, Alison knows this as well, that there's always another funding package coming out at the moment, and deadline for submission is the end of the week. And it's just frankly ridiculous. What we need is long-term funding strategies for us to be able to prepare for that and deliver it in the most appropriate way. Rochdale's taken advantage of a lot of this funding, so I shouldn't be too critical. But things like Future High Street Fund and Towns Fund, they're relatively small amounts of money, and they're sticking plasters. They're not addressing the major issues. Which is about long-term sustainability of town centres, and you can't do that through a funding bid within the next 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm conscious of a couple of audience questions. I'll come to them in just a minute. But I think one area where collaboration, one particular area where collaboration and a pan-regional approach is needed is transport. We've talked a bit about transport infrastructure. Melissa talked about that. But I wonder, from the developer's point of view, Chris, do you think Greater Manchester transport sort of initiatives or infrastructure at the moment is sufficient to link up the city region, improve connectivity for residents, and unlock further development, such as the projects that you're working on?
Well, if you'd asked me in February, I would say that it wasn't match fit, and we need to be able to get people from outside of Greater Manchester into Greater Manchester, and in particular into the city centre, as quickly as possible and as efficiently and as cost effectively as possible. But I think the jury's out on all of it. I mean, obviously, improved connectivity it will benefit the region, but I've lost track of where HS3, HS2, sort of part 2 is all up to, and I hope that the cost of COVID isn't going to set all that back, and that it's actually used. Major infrastructure will go ahead, because it will be needed. And as I said at the top of this, COVID is not going to reverse 100 years of urbanisation, so we still need the infrastructure. So I've lost track of where it's up to, and I hope that's not a deliberate thing, and it's because it's been put on the back burner.
Okay, now that's major infrastructure schemes. What do you reckon about the sort of smaller scale infrastructure schemes, which can help, create communities within some of the mixed use projects that many of you are working on?
I would like to see the tram network improved and increased. There's been talk of taking the tram out to Stockport. We have a vested interest. We are invested in Stockport at the moment, but I think that comes under a no-brainer, that the tram network goes out to the Stockport, and then ultimately it's then connected through to the airport and back through to Hale and Altrincham, and it's circulars that way. So the tram network extension, I think, should be a priority.
Mm-hmm. And I guess also,
I was just going to say, Sarah, I think when we're talking about transport, one area which we can be looking at more is the green infrastructure. So I was touching on before about the changes that COVID's brought in terms of how people view green infrastructure. But I think as a transport asset, it's another area we should be looking at. So we've got large amounts of canal towpaths and river corridors that move throughout the conurbation. And actually they could be used for cycling and walking, obviously for smaller distances, but you can cycle for a long way on a canal towpath to get between different areas as a form of commute. So I think that's just something we ought to be bringing into the mix when we're talking about transport and moving people around the city region. It's actually making sure we're using some of those assets that we actually already have. I just think that's something that we're often missing from that conversation about transport, is actually thinking about some of those greener ideas.
Yep, and that's interesting, the fact that, as you say, some of these assets are already there. They don't require putting down the line, do they?
Yep.
And actually,
probably a lot cheaper.
Yeah, and actually, we interviewed Louise Wyman a month or two ago and talked to her about what her priorities were for this is obviously Manchester City Council in the city, and she took over from Eddie Smith earlier in the year, and this was actually one of her things, that she wanted to use those canal towpaths, and she wanted to use some of these natural assets, and it contributes to overall livability. I mean, Alison, do you think this is something that could really help you in terms of your thinking about unlocking some of the sites that you're working on?
Well, definitely, yeah, particularly for Wigan with our beautiful canal network. So a bit of a plug there. So we've already, through the help of Greater Manchester, done some significant investments in cycling and walking networks across the borough, and we'll continue to do that. So we've been ahead of our sort of schedule in terms of delivery, and I think the demand's there as well, isn't it? I mean, certainly when we've done a COVID impact survey with residents, they're actually saying this is what they want. So there is a demand there as well. I think we all know you couldn't buy a bicycle or a second-hand bike during COVID because there's that many more people out on the bike. So it's certainly part of the Greater Manchester plans. And when we're putting through our spending submission, one of the main pillars on that submission is around connectivity. So we've got, the 4 pillars in our submission for Greater Manchester is around levelling up for communities, and infrastructure is part of that. So obviously, that we're trying to have a sort of London-style public transport system across the GM City region, radically improving our bus services, reducing car dependency, as Melissa said, is really important. So, we're looking at all of these areas, including green transport. Devolution of rail stations is a big issue for us, so they can play a larger part in communities, as well as buses, and integrating the rail stations into that wider transport network, so we can really support, I suppose, the wider development of placemaking and housing development, which is what we all want. And I think it links back to what John said, really, that what we need is a longer term infrastructure settlement. So within the submission that we're putting to government over the next couple of weeks, that capital infrastructure pot that we're looking for is around a 4-year infrastructure revenue support and capital support that will enable Greater Manchester to really try and deliver on some of its connectivity, housing, low carbon infrastructure and the green agenda. So, it's sort of, we're trying to, make it all connected and bring it all together.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Alison. Coming on to some of our audience questions, we've had a flurry. Recent experiences from Stuart Grant. Recent experience in behavioural change has put sustainability and the environment even higher on the agenda. It's now at the heart of everything. How is it affecting your own net zero plans? Alison, you touched on this in what you've just said, actually. I wonder about Chris, as the developer, how important is the net zero agenda to your work?
Well, it's extremely important, and it's extremely important that we understand how it affects the viability of developments, and we don't have an answer to that yet. But it is on our agenda, obviously. But we, as a developer, we just need to understand the cost implications of it.
Sure. Okay. So that's still, is it the sort of biggest barrier potentially, is it, to, I guess, up-greening buildings and sort of embedding that in plans being drawn up for buildings? It's already,
yeah, I mean, we want to develop the best, the greenest buildings schemes that we possibly can. So it's not a barrier. It's another opportunity, really. But what we, as I say, just, I don't want to repeat myself, but what we need to understand is the cost.
Sure. Okay, cool. John, what about you in terms of Rochdale's own strategy? How important is net zero, and how challenging is that concept as well?
Well, yes, very important, very challenging in a nutshell. Rochdale, like I think all of the GM authorities, have said that they need to deliver major climate change, and that's all part of the Greater Manchester clean air zones and approach to sustainability. And I think people's views on all this have changed, and again, this is a possible acceleration of COVID, isn't it? That in the same way that all of a sudden people got tuned into the use of plastics and we're really anti-plastic, I think this is starting to change through COVID as well. People thinking about sustainability, energy use, green space, access to the open air, the environment, clean air, of course, and they're all things that are becoming increasingly important to people, and that's starting, I think, to influence potential developments already going forward. We've been looking, as an example, at Rochdale Roadside Phase 2 development that includes apartments in the town centre, but looking at what outdoor space does that have? Balconies, access to green space, air handling units, all sorts of things like that potentially COVID has changed people's views, and they could be quite strong views as well. You touched on earlier the capital-centric scheme that we were working on in repurposing an old retail park into suburban living within the town centre next to the railway station. But that's all about a sustainable build. It's too easy to build kind of traditional 3-4 bedroom homes, semi-detached homes. We're trying to do something different actually, and do something that is sustainable and can be done at an appropriate cost to still keep viability there, which is the big challenge really that Chris is referring to.
Yeah, okay, and I guess the challenges are potentially even greater than in refurbishments. It's another question from Stephen Hopley. How will you deliver net carbon zero in refurbishments as opposed to new build to accelerate the timeframes? Maybe this will become, this is part of the conversation about using existing assets, isn't it? Repurposing existing assets.
I think just having the refurbishment and the kind of retrofitting of some of these greener measures is actually really important, because yes, we're building more and we can build in carbon resilience to some of those new developments, but actually we've actually got a massive amount of existing development that will need bringing up to spec effectively, and that is one area which I think we ought to be focusing slightly more on as well, in terms of how we can help existing buildings to bring themselves up to standard.
Brilliant, thanks, Melissa. We've got running out of time actually, but I think we've got time for maybe to address another couple of audience questions. One from Laura Sherlicker. The Greater Manchester Combined Authority has been allocated this 54.2 million from the Getting Building Fund. What impact do you think this will have? Do you feel there are any shortcomings, given the types of, I can't quite work that out now, but in terms of the projects that have been earmarked to receive this money? I wonder if well, perhaps John, actually, asking you from a local authority, will this be helpful to Rochdale's and other strategies?
I mean, yes, the answer is yes to that. The downside of that funding is it needs to be spent, committed, completed by March 2022, which is an extremely short time frame when you're talking about millions of spend, aren't you? So the good thing is, that is sucking in a significant amount of external funding from central government into GM. That is not a bad thing. But of course it's focusing then quite literally on the shovel ready schemes and projects, and therefore it's projects that are there on the shelf and probably we're at the starting line or thereabouts for delivery anyway. But what that will mean is we'll end up substituting some of that funding onto other projects that can't access funding. So ultimately it is a good thing, not necessarily in the kind of structured way we've been talking about there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and okay, so we've got a couple more questions. One that's had 5 votes and has been upvoted by our audience is about the Northern Gateway. Actually, it's going to be a massive development within Manchester. Has there been any further progress on this? Now, we don't necessarily have council we haven't got city council representative here who can talk us through that. I wonder if, Chris, from your point of view as a developer, how what's the scale of opportunity there? Is it very, very exciting? How viable is it? What are the challenges there? Is it making kind of rapid progress in your mind?
Oh, that's a big question, but I mean, of course, there are numerous opportunities with it. But what's slowing it down, I suppose, are getting hold of the sites, and viability, unlocking the sites and closing the viability gap. Okay,
and actually, Chris, while you're talking, a member of the audience, John Hartles, has asked you to expand on what you mean in regard to the affordability/cost question in regard to environmental impact and sustainability. He says it would be good to understand this. Can you give us a bit more detail on what specifically worries you about the costs involved in this?
Well, the worry is the unknown. It's the unknown element to it. So if we are being asked to deliver a certain specification, will the end user, whether it's an office building, whether it's a residential scheme, is the end user prepared to pay a premium to have a net carbon zero building? And I think I know the answer to that, and the market will decide that, and that's the worry.
What is the answer to that?
Well, I don't know.
Oh, you don't know? I thought you said you do know.
Sorry, I know
Okay.
that experience suggests that end users don't necessarily attach a premium to that, and the market will will ultimately decide the price that they will pay.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've probably got to wrap up there, even though there's obviously so much more that we could talk about. But I'd like to say a big virtual round of applause to our speakers for a really, really great conversation, and to our attendees for your questions and input. For the future, for the next panel after the break, please do keep on sending your questions through, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. And unlike sort of live events, we can actually sort of weave them into our conversation, and it can be a really good opportunity for interaction. So I think that's great. Could I ask you all to stay on for the networking break, and we'll be back for the second half presentation and panel at around 11:25. Let's now switch to networking mode. Thank you all, and see you shortly.
So moving on to the Manchester context, Greenbelt and controversy around it has been at the heart of GMSF's journey since its inception. Around 47% of Greater Manchester's total area is designated as Greenbelt. Now, in 2016, LUC produced a report which provided an objective, evidence-based assessment of the Greater Manchester Greenbelt and how it contributes to the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt. It also assessed the performance of sites that aren't currently within the Greenbelt to see if they were suitable for inclusion in the Greenbelt. And that original report was used in the drafting of the 2016 GMSF. Now, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, there were a lot of comments received to the public consultation of that document, and a large majority of those were about Greenbelt and being in opposition to release of Greenbelt land. A revised draft of the plan was consulted on last year, which showed a reduction in the amount of Greenbelt release of about 50% compared to the 2016 plan. And that was achieved by removing areas that had been earmarked for development and adding in some new areas. So LUC is currently carrying out further work to feed into the second stage of GMSF. But the scale of growth proposed for Greater Manchester means it's exceptionally likely that the final version will include some Greenbelt release. Now, we've touched on it in the first panel, but the next iteration of GMSF is due to be published later this year. And whilst there are some question marks over the detail and scope of that, what is clear is that the need for housing and employment development is not going to go away. And it's also clear that the Greenbelt is not going to be going away. So are there ways that we can look to see the Greenbelt as an area of opportunity and not just a constraint to development? And as a practice, we're increasingly trying to make links with another area where we have quite a strong track record, and that's green infrastructure planning. So I'm going to pass over here to my colleague Lucy, who's just going to run through a few of our current ideas on that front.
Thanks for that, Melissa. And just picking up on some of the things that Melissa has just mentioned, one of the things we've really been focusing on at LUC is this idea of helping to make the Greenbelt sort of work harder, and that's by enhancing the beneficial use of the land. So this is required by the NPPF. I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with paragraph 141 of the NPPF. But essentially what that is about is once a greenbelt's been defined by a local planning authority, there's a need to plan positively to enhance its beneficial use. So that's not just looking at openness, but it's looking at things like access, recreation, landscape, biodiversity, all these sort of key green infrastructure, GI functions, you know, as the GI jargon will have it. So this is where I think there's a real opportunity to bring together that kind of headline grabbing term of greenbelt together with other kind of emerging ideas, so things like green infrastructure and particularly natural capital. So yes, assessing the performance of greenbelt against openness as a function where it is potentially proposed to release, as there will be some of, but at the same time really assessing how that land is functioning in terms of GI and identifying where the existing greenbelt can be enhanced and provide more functions. Because greenbelt being ultimately about the absence of development and openness rather than other particular qualities, as Melissa just mentioned, sometimes it can be fantastic, but it doesn't always perform well on things like biodiversity, flood resilience, carbon sequestration, you know, all these really big key issues that we need to be looking at more, particularly with the 25-year environment plan in mind, for example. So just building on some of that and thinking about really the kind of maps that guide us in development. So we're very familiar with looking at certain kinds of maps. So we've seen a map of the kind of strange morphology of Greater Manchester's greenbelt, but maybe there are some other maps that we really need to start paying more attention to. So this one, as an example, is a map of kind of ecosystem services opportunities. This particular one is in the Irwell Valley catchment. That weaves through a really heavily kind of urbanised area, an area set for major change through development. But this is an exercise that's now been done across Greater Manchester. And it really highlights where improvements need to be directed to, and a lot of that is going to come through development. So luckily, Greater Manchester is doing a lot of really pioneering work on this. Things like the Natural Capital Investment Plan, also some of the mapping work being done by City of Trees together with the GNCA. And really, given the direction of travel in national policy, the development community is essentially going to have to become just as literate in these kind of maps as they might be in the past in sort of strategic transport infrastructure maps, the Greenbelt map itself, and those kind of maps. So that was my point about maps. So this just brings us on to why this is relevant to developers. And the point is that what we do with our greenbelt and how it performs is really important to everything we've been talking about this morning, actually. So first of all, particularly sat here in 2020, and this renewed focus on green space, that's because the greenbelt is really going to be the playground for people living in these regenerated areas where development is focused, particularly, you know, thinking about the kind of M60 towns we've talked about today, thinking about Rochdale, Stockport, Wigan, you know, a lot of what is driving those people potentially to those places and what is going to drive them is having this access to green space on the doorstep. So that's a really integral part. But secondly, because the greenbelt is going to play a really key part as the basis for our nature recovery network. So that's going to be mandated by the upcoming Environment Bill and implemented practically through policies such as biodiversity net gain. And on a more practical kind of site level, that means thinking about things like landscape-led design, landscape-led master planning. So this is starting with the trees, starting with the landscape features, rather than being kind of added on as a bit of token soft landscaping at the end of the design process. That all needs sort of front loading and paying more attention to. And just finally, I think we can't end any kind of discussion around green space without locating ourselves firmly in 2020. You know, the experience of lockdown has really transformed people's expectations of where they live, and particularly the value of green spaces at every scale, whether that is a strategic country park that they might be in the green belt, or indeed a national park, or whether that's community level parklets, community growing spaces. This picture here is of a community level space that we worked on in Heron Street in South Manchester. But also thinking about the role of that in urban regenerated areas. And so just bring it back to where we started talking about greenbelt, you know, the key point again is that these green spaces, in order to function fully, need to be connected together. And that's where the greenbelt comes in, particularly in those areas where you've seen the strange morphology of the greenbelt, where it reaches in as green fingers into urban areas and surrounding some of these regenerated areas. Finish up, yes, and clearly, despite the planning reforms, it's not going anywhere. But we do think that we need to start looking beyond those 5 purposes set out in the NPPF and really adding that GI sort of layer to our thinking about what that land does. So I'll just hand back to Melissa to finish off.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. So I think all that there is left to say really is thanks very much for listening. Hopefully that's been a useful rattle through the green belt, which has probably provoked some thoughts and questions, and hopefully it has. We've got several members of our Manchester office in attendance today, and we'd love to carry on the conversation on any of the topics raised, or to discuss anything related to planning, impact assessment, landscape design, ecology, or geospatial services. But I think I shall leave it there for today. So thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Melissa and Lucy. Really interesting. And I think certainly it does lend even more weight and context to both our macro conversation in the first panel session and our second panel that's going to take place now. So if our next set of speakers could make their way to the stage, i.e. activate their cameras and mics, please. We're going to discuss public and private strategies for town centre regeneration with a new set of developers, councils and experts who are Michael Dong, Chief Executive of Investar Group, Richard Rowe, Director of Place at Trafford Council, Thomas Pearson, Partner at JMW Solicitors, Paul Richards, Director of Development and Regeneration at Stockport Council and Chief Executive of the Stockport Mayoral Development Corporation, and Maggie Grogan, Senior Development Surveyor at Muse Development. Welcome to you all.
Hi. Morning.
And there's a siren sounding, so it's almost as if we are in the city centre all together.
I am indeed, yeah.
Right then, so all of you are working on exciting and often large-scale projects, from Investar's Stockport College redevelopment, Royal George Village, Trafford Civic Quarter Master Plan, Stretford Mall revamp, Therma Leisure and Wellness Complex, and Muse at Crompton Place and Church Wharf and Bolton, to name just a few. So to kick off our chat, I'd like to ask our local authority speakers first, just to outline the scale of opportunity for development in their areas, in their boroughs. What are the untapped sectors and locations, and what are you doing to attract private sector investment? So Richard, would you like to go first?
I can do. Thank you, Sarah, and morning, everyone. From a Trafford perspective, our focus is partly driven by the GMSF. I know we've touched on that a number of times already this morning, but our strategic location out at Carrington remains a significant driver for economic and housing growth within the borough, and we're working very closely with landowners there. And then a focus around town centres. We continue to have a focus around all our town centres, in particular at the moment on Stretford and the area around Stretford. We see that as a real opportunity for us to bring forward regeneration in an area that has been seen underinvestment for a period of time, with a huge amount of community buy-in at the moment. We've just started last week our consultation on the area action plan for Stretford. And we see the community really wanting to work with us to bring forward regeneration and redevelopment. And we are waiting on the outcome for our future High Street Fund bid, which went in with a focus on Stretford again. HS2, another important area for us, and potentially an untapped location, assuming HS2 does go ahead. So very, very interesting to see that start has been made on site, but still a huge amount of work to be done on the phase 2 and bringing HS to Airport and into Piccadilly. But that not just for Trafford, but for GM as a whole, HS2 as an opportunity to be a fantastic economic driver, even in a post-COVID world. From a sector side, I think we are working through what the implications of COVID are and wider structural changes within the retail sector. We, as with other authorities, have invested in to town centres because we think that was the right thing for us to do, and taking on control either solely or in partnership of some of the key town centre assets. But we need to work through what the future role of town centres is. We have seen a change dynamic. We've seen changes in how people use their town centres, and I think that's one that we're really keeping an eye on, and what that means in terms of leisure use. And we're starting to get quite a lot of leisure use interest, particularly around Altrincham, but elsewhere as well. That significantly over the last few years, but what that means over the next 5 or 10 years, particularly the hotel sector, I think is something that we'll keep a close eye on.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Richard. There's a slight sort of connectivity issue with your video there, but we can still hear you, but perhaps keep an eye on that. But thanks for that overview. Can I turn to you, Paul, with the same question? Stockport's certainly been pretty busy in recent months. We're kicking off several council-led projects, such as the revamp of the Mersey shopping centre. And many others. What's in your in tray at the moment?
I promised I wouldn't talk for 45 minutes on Stockport, Sarah, but I'll try my best. I mean, Stockport's journey over the last 6 or 7 years in terms of regeneration is well trodden, lots of things, but yeah, that work continues. So Stockport Exchange has delivered a third phase within the current lockdown and also let some of that third phase, which is quite encouraging in spite of some of the warnings for the office market. Yeah, we continue on leisure and on retail. I suppose the biggest single focus is the Mayoral Development Corporation and what that brings in terms of a chunk of a town centre. So, 130 acres of the town centre focused primarily on residential, but not just on residential. So there's 1 million square foot of workspace in there as well. And I guess outside of a town centre, we started pre-COVID looking at how we can take the lessons from the town centre out to our district centres, and that work will continue.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, on the MDC, we were talking earlier. It's been, I think, a year yesterday, was it? Since Stockport launched the Mayoral Development Corporation, and it was the first of its kind in the Northwest, and it's one of only 4 in the country. So it's a pretty new approach to governance and delivery of town centre regeneration strategies. Can you talk us through how has it been doing? Has it helped? Are there things that you've been able to do in the past year which you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
I don't think we'd have got Lord Kerslake as chair had we not set it up. So yeah, I think it's been an interesting 12 months. So in that 12-month period, we've published an SOF. We've developed a £100 million investment strategy for the council to invest in, with the intention of leveraging that investment through private investment, which is part of the theme of today. 3,500 new homes, and some of those have been delivered, and we probably have. I'm conscious Michael's on the panel, but we have about 1,100 in pipeline at the moment of that 3,500, which we said we'd deliver over 15 years. But in addition to that, we are about to publish some work on Stockport Station, about to publish some work on infrastructure that forms part of the GM infrastructure plan. It's a case study for GM infrastructure plan. So lots and lots of things, and some site assembly as well. So some more news coming on the MDC very shortly. We're about to boost the MDC board, so we'll be shortly announcing some new MDC board members who have some really interesting names to bring into the mix. Yeah, lots going on, Sarah.
That's just a teaser, really, isn't it? Okay, great. Thanks for giving that overview, Paul. Turning now to our developers in the room then. Michael, you're obviously working with Paul and other boroughs, and you've purchased properties such as the former Stockport College plot from the public sector. I think it was Homes England in this case. What's been your experience of public-private collaboration to progress your schemes? And what would you like to see more of, and what would you like to see less of? I know that you've got your partner in the room with you here, but yeah, if you could give us an overview of that.
Maybe I have to be careful what we say. I think it's like any marriage. You have to start with the right mindset and the value, and these two have to be aligned first. I think for investors and developers, they will always look for strong civic leadership, and for councils that has a clear direction and strategy, and also have internal support politically to carry out a big scheme before sending private companies running around, and also private companies going into a partnership. They shouldn't have the priority of profit as first place. It's I think it's per person need to go before profit. That's our mantra, and you have to the focus has to be getting the job done. If you do the right things and do it right, the profit will come anyway, but as a bonus. The other important thing for me is collaboration. If both parties set the journey together with the starting with the end in mind, and have a clear understanding what was the desired outcome, and have very clear communication throughout, and be really, I think John mentioned earlier, be really open book. From our experience, you know, we'll be open book with our agenda, with the program, and with the profit. So you know, if share the resources, share the challenges. If you can't do it, or if out of your capacity, let them know, to tell them honestly, and that I think that creates the trust, and that creates the respect as well. And in a way, they sometimes help you to find a way to challenge that, because everybody's interests are aligned.
And what would you say about this Mayoral Development Corporation? Is this the sort of approach that you would like to see in other councils that you're working with?
Yeah, definitely. I think it has to have any big projects have to have the political support. It can't be just you know, an idea locally from office level, or from an idea from the developer. That vision has to be aligned first, and definitely that will help with other local authorities.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that, Michael. Maggie, what are your thoughts on all of this? How is Muse working with Bolton and other councils to regenerate town centres, and how do you ensure that your projects align with the economic and the development challenges that the local authorities are trying to address?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think Michael...
You're quite quiet, Maggie. A little bit.
Okay, sorry.
Maybe, yes, maybe a bit further up.
Very good points. We all have our own part to play, and we need to all play to our strengths. So from a local council point of view, as Michael said, it needs to come from the top. They need to be, you know, looking at the funding side of it and looking at how they can support us. But then from our point of view is staying on where we see the market and really taking a leadership in that, and putting forward what we see as the right things to do at the right time. And I think, especially in the current climate, doing the right projects at the right time is going to be really key. And actually the private sector taking those forward and pushing them forward is going to see real benefits within those local authorities. But I think from the outset, you have to be really aligned in having quite an ambitious vision for regeneration and for the partnerships, and looking at the big infrastructure plays that might come on board with those. So for example, working with Salford Council at the minute, looking at the Crescent and what we might do up there, looking at some of those big infrastructure plays, because you need to develop your whole master plan around those. So understanding from the outset, from both the private and the public sector, how we might bring those forward, I think is really important then for the regeneration and developing out the master plan to make sure that both sides get the best from it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Maggie. We are getting a little bit of feedback or some sort of audio distortion. I don't know who it's coming from, but yeah, just a reminder to all of our speakers, just to keep any sort of background movements to a minimum and things like that. And if you're using headphones, to sort of speak into the microphone or anything. Thank you for that. So actually, Maggie, where do you think then, because you sort of talked about how the private sector, it's actually very much, particularly at a time we find ourselves in now, it's actually very important for the private sector to try and lead on this and really try and sort of support the local authorities in their visions. So where do you see as the untapped opportunities right now across Greater Manchester?
I think there's a massive opportunity in affordable housing that the public and private sector could really work together on. I think we see it being delivered, but in very small pockets around cities at the minute. And I think in partnerships, you could really work together to deliver that on a larger scale if the public sector are willing to come in. We all know that there's often a viability gap with affordable housing. And so therefore, if the public and private can work together to start to deliver that on a bigger scale, I think we could really answer some of the questions that are being asked around affordable deliverability.
That's really interesting. I wonder, Michael, if you've got any thoughts about that, sort of untapped opportunities that aren't currently being exploited across Greater Manchester, whether it's sector or location.
Yeah, I agree with what Maggie just mentioned, affordable homes. That's one great opportunity. And the other thing I want to mention is the regeneration of town centres. Following post-COVID, the quickest way to get economy going again is to get building construction. We saw that post the Second World War, and we'll see that post-COVID, and it's not just the local authority or developers that want to do it. It's the agenda of the central government, and everybody needs these big schemes to start kicking off. I think it's going to be a huge opportunity coming forward. In terms of the sector, logistics, biologistics, and also industry, warehouse, and all this to fit into the new norm, the post-COVID, to help the transportation of the vaccine, the making of vaccines, etc. I think that's going to be the answer to PPE and also online shopping. And I think that's going to be a very good opportunity.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that, Michael. Before we move on to sort of drill into some of these topics in a bit more detail, we've had a question from the audience, which is it's actually about the Environment Bill. Are developers factoring in the emergence of upcoming biodiversity net gain requirements into their thinking once the Environment Bill is passed? And is it being viewed as an opportunity or as a constraint? So I think that's obviously one for you and Maggie, Michael. Maggie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, certainly. I think, again, related to COVID, but also related to that, is the fact that open public space will be seen as much more beneficial going forward. I think we see across the city that there has been a lack of green space, and certainly one of our key drivers is to bring that into developments more. So whether it be residential, whether it be public realm, one of our key things is to definitely start greening up the areas more and to look at how we can increase the biodiversity of the master plans that we're doing. Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Do you have anything to add to that, Michael?
Yeah, just to give you an example, the Royal George Village scheme that we are currently working on, in the middle of designing, and COVID came, and that kind of forced us to rethink and about the whole thing and future-proof the design. So we look at the optimization of the green space, public amenity, and also enlarging the home working into each of the homes. So I think that's we'll see a trend of that, and going back to what we said earlier about the regeneration of local towns, not just city centres, that might be a trend of people looking for bigger space and greener space outside the city centre, where places like Bolton, Trafford, and Stockport might thrive even more.
Okay, yeah, one to watch, I think. Okay, Thomas, from your experience with your clients, I'd love to get your view on what you would say constitutes effective and successful collaboration between the public and private sector on all of the above sort of opportunities that we've discussed. And also, a secondary point, how has COVID-19 affected those delivery strategies? Has anything changed in terms of the approach that both parties are taking?
I think the first one's quite easy in that, in fairness, we've had a direct example of that today. Michael and Paul, case in point here, and Alison summed it up really well in that the public and private partnerships are working well. That's not to say, and John alluded to some points earlier on his panel discussion, that there aren't hiccups. But the key thing really, and I appreciate their buzzwords, is that collaboration and that engagement. We've got a willingness, and we're really, really fortunate, I'd say, within Greater Manchester, that you've got people who are approachable, who are willing to have that conversation and willing to work together. We have had over the last few years, and continue to have as a lookout around, cranes up in the city centre. There are still opportunities for things to happen centrally. However, more of the opportunities, case in point, Stockport, Sale, Timperley, Ancoats, Oldham, Rochdale, all of those other places, the proximity to the city centre is fantastic. And the fact that you've got the GMSF, which we talked about, working, and all of those bodies work in collaboration together with developers is interesting. I think the other point as well, which is important, flipping it onto the developers side, and I'd like to think that we see this, is people talk. So it's important to have that relationship and that rapport, and to be on the right level at day one. So to strike up that relationship and have it with the councillors, with the relevant people who are looking at the development, that will get noticed if you then go and have a conversation in another area within Greater Manchester. As to the COVID effect, an interesting one. Michael touched on something which I've been looking at and certainly seeing with clients. The Royal George Village was at that point where they could pause and have a bit of a rethink in terms of design and how they look at points. And I think that will be relevant. There are some schemes that are on for delivery that can't. And over the period of time, talking with colleagues and employees and other professionals, those that live in the city centre effectively in a glass box, who haven't been able to use all of the services, have felt somewhat stifled. So it's pleasing to hear Michael and some of our other clients look at the opportunities for home working, the opportunities for green space. And I think from a local authorities perspective, Paul and Richard might echo this, that's probably going to be more welcome in terms of looking at that opportunity and offering going forwards.
Okay, yeah, I think that's really interesting. What about some of the sort of the legal side, Thomas? We saw during lockdown how much construction was hit by delays and funding challenges. It got back on its feet, certainly, and plenty of projects were continued and even completed across Greater Manchester in the last few months. But certainly there's been a lot of talk about, say, COVID clauses in development contracts, trying to preempt any similar future situation that would mean parties can't complete a scheme on time. What do you think about these clauses? Have they actually started becoming common? Are they going to become increasingly commercially acceptable? And are there any other kind of legal protections or mechanisms that public-private development partnerships should put in place at this time and going forward?
I'll distinguish, if I may. I'm going to talk about transactional as opposed to construction, because that's more my area. Within the JCT realms, there are things that exist as regards to force majeure and clauses there, but I'll focus on the other side. Certainly, if we talk residential, just to start with, from a residential perspective, a lot of the conveyancers were putting COVID clauses in where their clients might not be able to complete or might not be able to move home. Those constraints have moved over, notwithstanding what's coming in on Monday, but people are being able to move home, mortgages are available. Future planning, a contract in a sense is kind of two parties want to do a deal that metaphorically will shake hands or fist bump in the new COVID world, and the contract provides for the what ifs. the nitty gritty of what needs to happen. Now, in a development deal, a lot of that might be hinged on planning, might be linked to environmental searches, etc. And you'd have the general provision of a long stop date. In other words, you need to have achieved the conditionality has to be satisfied by that point. And if for whatever reason planning hasn't landed, or you're sat in a judicial review period, you'll have an extension to what I'd call a drop dead date. I think it would be healthy to explore, and we've certainly been doing this with our clients under those type of deals, having a clause in for the unknown happening. The problem is commercially, whether that's going to be acceptable for both parties. If I was just to draft a COVID clause and make reference to COVID-19 and not being doom and gloom, well, in black and white, that might not cover COVID-20 if it happens. So are we talking general pandemics, and what do people want? Fundamentally, from a contractual law perspective, you can't have an open-ended agreement. So you need to have some finality on that. But I think it's certainly coming back to that working in partnership and everybody. If people want the deal to happen, they can agree it, but it would be sensible, certainly me acting for a developer, to have some form of protection and an acknowledgement that the world isn't how we used to have it. And we need to have something in there to protect for certain uncertain scenarios. You can't cover everything, but you've got to have something in there. And it comes back to collaboration and people being sensible and talking it through.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I'd love to ask our other panelists about what they think about this. I'll come on to the developers because I'd love to hear whether you would have liked to see this kind of protection. But first of all, Paul, what do you make of all of this? You know, does this work from the council side and is it commercially acceptable from the council and from the placemaking point of view?
So I think there's a couple of points here, Sarah. I think the first one is perhaps just to take a step back, and what we do is long term in its nature. You know, from identifying a site to handing someone the keys to their apartment. That's a 3-year process. So let's not confuse the current situation with the more longer term situation. I think in terms of the contractual position, it's risk and reward, isn't it? And you know, each party has to take the same approach to risk and reward. Certainly, partners that we're in collaboration with are ones that understand that and accept that in the approach. I think it's challenging to think that the public sector won't look at this commercially.
Yeah, public sector, what do you make of it,
into these schemes?
I mean, Paul's right. We have to protect the public purse, so we have to ensure that we are dealing with this appropriate commercially. But if you think about some of the things that Michael was talking about around the structure of partnerships and the things that underpin the partnerships, which is less about the contractual position, but is about a shared vision, values, shared outcomes, then if you have that right structure in place, then you know we are dealing with a short-term hit. You know, Paul's on a 3-year timescale. That's it. Some of the things that we're talking around. You know, some of the development plans are working over 5, 10, 15 years. So in that, something that happens that gives you a 6-month hit or a 9-month hit, you know, it could be a pandemic, it could be something else. I think if you are immediately going to fall back on a contractual position and say we're going to enforce now, then I think you have to question, is that the right partnership anyway? Because actually what should you be saying is, are the things that we're trying to achieve still the right things? How do we use the contractual position that we've got and the relationship to work through this and determine what the final outcome is that we're looking for, rather than just jumping in on a short term gain? So from the local authority perspective, you know, we're going to be around for an awful long time, and it's not just what happens tomorrow, it's what happens 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, because that's the time frame in which our communities and residents are living in the places that we are looking to create.
Yes, and maybe that actually is sort of, it's a different thing, isn't it, than looking specifically at what needs to change or what needs to be delivered now or what needs to be achieved now. I wonder for Maggie and Michael, would you have would this have been useful to you, a COVID contract over the past, or COVID clause over the past few months? You know, would you have liked to have some protections? Have you seen any slippage in your schemes? You know, what's been the impact for you? Perhaps you can start with that, Maggie.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Richard said, which is if you started to get the contract off the shelf, then you're probably failing in your partnership. You know, as Richard said, as long as you've got the right outcomes in mind and the same values, you don't go back to that contract very often. It's sort of signed and it's put on the shelf, and then you all crack on with it. So from a COVID point of view, I think the best partnerships have already got the flexibility built into them that when things like this come along, because projects will always have delays, whether it's, well, not always, but, you know, whether it's COVID or whether it's something else, quite often delays are experienced. And as Richard and Paul have said, it's about how both parties deal with that and move it forward rather than falling out about it and, you know, getting contractual about it. So I think COVID just goes alongside all of the other challenges that we have with these types of projects, rather than it needing to be a specific clause within contracts going forward. As long as you've all got the right goals in mind, you will get on together to achieve those.
Okay, yeah, sure. Michael, you're nodding your head in agreement.
Yeah, everything has been said in total agreement. I like what Maggie said. I think it's not about what happened to you, it's about how you deal with the problem that's happened to you. That's more important. Like Richard and Paul said, that it is about collaboration, and the tone has been set from the start. I'll definitely follow Thomas' lead on this one, because they got better brain than us. But with working with public sector, personally, I'll be more relaxed about COVID clause there or not. But maybe with a private landowner, etc., that's probably we need to be a little bit more watertight with the contract. You know, with the schemes and the sort of scheme we're in discussion with the local authorities, like it's been mentioned, that could be 10, 15 years schemes. So it almost doesn't matter what happened. Whereas if you buy a piece of land for 4 million and the vendor needs the money in 6 months' time, that's crucial to them, and then we need to be really careful. And the challenge that a developer faces is that the lenders, post-COVID, they might take a different view, and they might take a different view from today from tomorrow. So we need that little bit of protection, just in case and they pull the funding in the last minute, and we have to protect ourselves and be able to go back to the vendor. Look, this happened, and let's resolve it together.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think it brings us on to another sort of meaty topic, which is the sort of flexibility of schemes, building greater flexibility of schemes into schemes because of this period we find ourselves in, and basically how the pandemic has impacted the actual content of schemes. Richard, I wonder if the months of lockdown, has prompted a period of reflection by councils and developers as to whether their proposals are fit for purpose in a pandemic-struck world. What do you make of this? Is Trafford reviewing any of its plans, or are developers you're working with reviewing any of their plans?
I think for us it's a mixed picture at the moment. So we've got plans that are still proceeding. So our site that we own in the Civic Quarter with Bruntwood, we are cracking on. Planning application is going to planning committee in a couple of weeks' time. It's a plan we've been working on for a period of time, and similar in Stretford. Elsewhere, town centre scheme in Altrincham at the Grafton Centre, we were going down a path. We put a hold on that. We've appointed CBRE to do some work and to do a review of that. So, the path that we were going down, was that the right path? Are there different things that we should be doing given the location of that centre and what's happening in towns? I think what we've seen kind of more broadly is that developers who were in the system already have cracked on. So the number of applications that we've have gone through the planning system have remained actually increased. So in the last 6 months, we've approved more residential units than we had in the 6 months previously. But the actual number of applications coming in have dropped, and have dropped by about a third for our major applications. What that suggests is, if you started, developers are continuing, and I think certainly they've seen a lot of strength in the residential sector. But if you've not fired the starting gun, I think actually that's when you stop view and take a view. Is this still the right thing to do?
Right. Okay.
The planning system isn't always that flexible, is it? And I think that's part of the challenge.
Yeah.
That we have to accept.
Absolutely. Paul, what's your experience of this? Is Stockport rethinking some of its sort of bigger frameworks or plans at the moment?
I think very similar to Richard. So what made our plans credible and relevant pre-COVID, just thinking of that long-term nature of what we do, they'll still be relevant. People will still need houses, we'll need to deal with our town centres, we'll need to think about how we transform brownfield land. What is more challenging is some of those schemes which have no immediate return in the face of the challenges to the public purse more generally as a result of COVID. But I don't think we've stopped anything. We might have slowed down a couple of things. We might have rechanged a couple of plans. But we're still proceeding on most fronts. And as far as the MDC is concerned, I'm just looking. I don't want to steal one of your questions, Sarah, but just looking at some of the questions in the Q&A, the one thing that we've taken from COVID to turn a negative into a positive, the MDC plan was built on green space and sustainability and localism, for want of a better description. I think that was all done 12 months ago, pre-COVID, and that is as relevant today, if not more relevant today, than it was when we first started work on the SOF. So I think still lots of positives, lots of investor appetite, even those that aren't in the market. We've got a couple of resi sites on the market at the moment, massive investor appetite in those. So a generally
Michael,
positive picture in Stockport.
Have you guys sort of tweaked any of your plans, whether it's in Stockport or elsewhere, in light of all of this? And would you like to also answer this question from Stuart Grant as well? What's the one thing that you've taken from this time in terms of turning a negative into a positive for development?
We'll answer the second question first. I like that question, because we're all about dealing with situations, and then there's always silver lining. Whatever happens, there's always something positive come out of it. It just depends on how you look at it and how you deal with it and how you manage the situation. And I think COVID has been talked negatively, but really we should look at that as a new opportunity, as a reset button for everyone. And I'll give you an example for us. And we started the year setting up a mission for us to build 10,000 homes in the next 10 years, and then COVID happened. But we were not going to defer by that, and we've been really very active during the pandemic, during the lockdown period, and exchanged on around about 700 units during that time, and gone in planning with them. So expect them to come out of the planning process, gain plan ticket at Q4 this year. The example, the purpose of the example is to say that COVID makes some of the developers and councils really switch on, and it's just a catalyst for whatever was happening, but speeding up the process. Retail is going down further, and shorten the next 10 years downward spiral into maybe 2-3 years, and it forces people to react to it or proactively deal with it even faster than before. I think do we change our strategy? No, not at all. We just proceed and even speed up what we're going to do. But on the detail level, on the technical level, we do change our we do change how we design the schemes and how we work with the local authorities, how we work with vendors and our funders, and adapting what COVID is giving us. But I think, like what Paul said, the direction has been set before COVID is still relevant, and we should carry on doing it.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, I think all of this does point to the need for sort of greater flexibility in development strategies, more generally, or continued flexibility if it's already there in some partnerships. Thomas, looking more broadly at policy making, what do you think is needed to help spur development across Greater Manchester? Have the tweaked council planning processes during lockdown led to better decision making, and how might the generic planning reforms help? For example, maybe the relaxation of use classes is a potentially very useful one for developers, particularly as they seek to sort of slightly tweak the design and the uses within their schemes.
I think it would be unfair to say that the streamlined planning has led to better decision making. I think it's possibly more just streamline as regards to needs must in the current situation. People couldn't meet and committees couldn't happen. But having talked to clients, I think they've welcomed that. Some local authorities have picked it up, some haven't, but they've welcomed that more streamlined approach, the ability to discharge conditions promptly, and proceed all of those. And as Michael alluded to, acquiring an asset, putting planning in and planning due in Q4. So that I think has helped. The general theme though is that we were, and it would be wrong to think that COVID has come about and stopped everything. There was great momentum happening within the city centre and within Greater Manchester, and it's on pause. It's not been stopped completely because of COVID. And we need to use the opportunities, both negative and positive, as a springboard. As to the use classes point, new use classes order came in at the beginning of September. We were already experiencing and seeing clients using the permitted development rights and the ability to convert some of the redundant spaces. The devil's always in the detail on that, so I'll leave that for the planners, but there are still some opportunities. And I think within the city centre, as we've talked about, what's happening with retail was already happening, but COVID has been a catalyst to speed that up. So there are spaces and buildings available. What that will be, I think, will be dictated a lot by, Marcel's got a question there and he's talking about major leisure and event spaces. I think a lot of that comes to footfall. Marcel's question, I think, on the Q&A is probably more linked to, say, a destination. So we can look at all of those opportunities and what's there. I'm for, and I'd be interested to get Paul and Richard's stance from their side. From my experience, my clients have found it helpful having that streamlined perspective. There's obviously an accountability that exists as regards to the council and ensuring that the planning process is correctly followed. But having more clarity and streamlining the planning process to allow development where it's appropriate to happen, to progress and get through to starting on sites quicker, I'm pro.
Brilliant. I think that's really, I think it'd be great to actually hear from one of the local authorities. Richard, perhaps, what do you think about the sort of potential planning changes in the pipeline? We touched on this a bit in panel one. What do you make of them?
I think we're kind of agnostic a little bit at the moment. There are some things in there that we quite like and actually closely mirror the approach that we're taking. So if you think about our Stretford and Civic Quarter Master Plan, which is a land use area action plan, land use plan, combined with the design guide that we are currently working on, is a model that actually pretty closely relates to what's in the white paper. So I think, there are certainly some advantages of it. anything that can help streamline the planning system, I think we would also welcome. We've seen the length of our committee reports has grown exponentially over the last 5 or 10 years, because there's constantly more and more that we have to put in there, and that's all part of what slows down the system. Permitted use rights and change of use does give us some concern, though. The planning system is there; it should be there to support good quality development and bring forward good quality development. Permitted development rights can actually enable development that isn't necessarily the right type of development in the right location. It becomes something that it's a response to an opportunity driven rather than a place shaping driven, and that is our concern. And we can probably all point at changes of office to resi conversions that are not something that we would necessarily want to have gone ahead in terms of the quality of the product that's produced for both those people living in those buildings and those people, living outside and affected by that. And that is part of the challenge that as a sector, I think we need to consider.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now we're approaching the end of our session. Actually, I would love to address all of these questions. We've touched on them, our audience questions. I do have one more that I would like to address before we wrap up, and that's the future of financing for large-scale development schemes, local authority financing. I'm wondering whether we'll continue to see a rise in property investments and acquisitions by councils, or is it increasingly the other way around? Now, I know that we've got to wrap up in 2 minutes, so I wonder if any of our local authority representatives want to tackle that one in about 1 minute. Yes, Paul?
I think we will continue to see a growth of investment on behalf of local authorities, but hopefully only for the purposes that PWLB was intended. So there's a bit of a Stockport plug. We have only ever used PWLB for regeneration. We've never bought an investment just to fill a cash hole with it. I think we should continue to see that, because that's what it's there for. It is designed to help authorities.
That was snappy. Would anyone else like to add to that? And if anyone has to sort of drop out at 12:30, that's absolutely fine.
I think just to follow up on Paul's point, it's not necessarily the same approach that Trafford has always taken. The changes to the guidance force you down that route. Now, I think we have to recognise the position in which local authorities operate. They have always bought properties for an investment return. This is not unusual. Most local authorities will own a series of shops, and I've been in authorities before that have owned farms. Across the GM authorities, we have our stake in Manchester Airport. Some of these are regen and some of these are investment return, and the local authority budgets are incredibly challenged at the moment. But I don't see a stop in local authorities continue to use PWLB to invest in regeneration and regeneration returns, and that's absolutely the right thing to do, both for the investment return, but also it needs the public sector to take the lead. The private sector will flow from that, and I think you can demonstrate generally and usually a significant return on that investment, but certainly our experience, and thinking about Altrincham in particular, the private sector investment followed the local authority taking the first stake and putting that investment in. And I think private sector partners, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for the authority to create the environment that enables them to come in and then invest and support delivery.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Obviously, there's so much more we could have talked about, and I feel like we're sort of scratching the surface, but what a great conversation. And thank you so much to our speakers for their comments and views, and also to our audience for your engagement and your questions. We've covered a lot of ground this morning. I hope the event has been useful and interesting for everyone watching. Thank you again to our sponsors, JMW Solicitors, Morgan Sindall Construction, LUC and Curtains. If you enjoyed the networking and want to give it another go, we do have a further half hour. So you could stay around and chat to fellow guests, share thoughts on today's subject, and arrange follow-up meetings in the other room. Our next Place Northwest event will be the Future of Retail and Leisure on the 17th of September. You can register via our website. So see you soon, and thanks very much again for coming today.